Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world without clocks, without comfort, and certainly without coffee. A time when the day began long before the sun had the courtesy to show up, and ended only when your limbs no longer obeyed you. We're traveling back to a medieval village where life wasn't measured in moments of joy, but in how much you could endure before the next task came calling. Before we get started, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, only if you're really enjoying the content I share here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this little community reaches. Now lower the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some relaxing background noise, and let's settle in for tonight's story. You'll meet Edric, his wife Elise, and the quiet, grueling life they shared in a world where comfort was rare and labor was relentless. Their bed is scratchy, their bread is hard, and their days are long. But for now, just rest easy, and let yourself drift into a time when the only thing predictable was the next hour of work. Edric was already awake when the cold crept under the blanket. He didn't move, not yet. He lay flat on his back, staring into the blackness of a ceiling he couldn't see. The thatched roof above groaned faintly with the weight of morning frost. And something, a mouse, maybe, scratched softly between the beams. Beneath him, the straw mattress crunched and itched, thick with the damp must of nights spent in unwashed linen and wool. The hut was quiet, save for the sound of slow breathing beside him, his wife, Alice, and the occasional shifting grunt of their youngest, curled at the foot of the bed, tangled in the remnants of a tattered cloak. The air inside the single-room cottage was cold enough to sting exposed skin, and his toes, numb from the night, curled uselessly against the floor's roughness through a hole in his sock. Outside, it was still dark. The world had not yet stirred, but it would. And soon, Edric closed his eyes again, just for a moment. He wasn't hoping for rest, he just didn't want to start, not yet. The morning did not arrive with light, but with obligation. As always, it came first to Edric not through the sky, but through his spine. The ache began in his lower back and stretched upward, dragging behind it the familiar chorus of stiff knees and sore shoulders. He sat up slowly, blinking into the gloom. His breath fogged the air. The hearth had long since gone cold, its ashes pale and undisturbed. Alice stirred beside him. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. The day had begun. Somewhere across the village, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The rooster hadn't crowed yet, likely curled up in the warmest corner of the henhouse, smarter than most of them. But Edric swung his legs to the floor anyway, landing with a soft thud on packed dirt still damp from last week's rain. The hut was small, smaller than it looked from the outside, and every inch of it had already been lived into the bone. Tools lined the wall by the door, a rusting sickle and a splintered rake. A cracked bucket lay beside them, half filled with soot-black water from the last downpour. The ceiling drooped in the middle where years of snow had pressed it downward like a slow curse. Alice pulled her shift tighter around her shoulders and rose without complaint. She crossed the room in silence, barefoot, stepping over the children, careful not to wake them. The girl, Lena, was old enough to help. The boy, Bram, was not, but would try anyway. It was how things worked. No one asked, no one waited. They just rose and did. The fire would need to be restarted, but the kindling was wet, and they'd used the last dry logs during the storm 3 nights ago. Alice pulled her woolen scarf from a nail and wrapped it tightly over her ears. Edric rummaged through the pile of worn tunics by the wall and chose the one that itched the least, though not by much. He threaded his belt without looking, the muscle memory of labor, stronger than sight or thought. Outside, The village remained mostly still, but it too was waking. A wooden shutter creaked open 2 doors down. The soft slap of boots in mud followed. Somewhere a cough echoed, rough and wet. It was old Bren, surely, dragging his twisted foot toward the public latrine, muttering about pigs and saints. The village smelled of wet hay, cold smoke, and the earthy, sour rot of too many bodies and not enough soap. But none of it was new. This was the scent of home and of labour that never left enough time to notice how bad it had become. Breakfast was not something one looked forward to. It simply happened. Alice stirred the pottage over the hearth with a stick rather than a spoon. The latter had cracked 2 winters ago and was still on the to mend list, somewhere below patch the roof and keep surviving. The pottage was thin today, just barley gruel, salted with nothing but yesterday's sweat. There'd been a few onions last week, but they were gone now. Meat was a luxury they didn't count on. Even salt was something you measured in pinches, not scoops. Lena awoke with a whimper and reached for the bowl before she sat up. Bram followed, his curls matted with straw. No one said grace. They didn't dare offend Father Toman, who insisted on proper prayers, but no one in Edric's house wasted words on empty bellies. They ate in silence, letting the warmth of the bowl fight briefly against the chill of the hut. By the time the village triangle rang, a dull clang struck 3 times by the priest's hammer, Edric was already halfway down the slope to the fields. The frost crunched under his boots as he walked, his breath thick in the dawn air. He carried his hoe over one shoulder and a small bundle of rye seed under the other arm. The path wound past the baker's hut, the chimney still cold, and the smithy, where the door remained shut tight. In the field, the rows from last season had collapsed into soft trenches of mud. Edric stepped into the first one, sighed, and began to work. One pull, another, and another. The sun had not yet cleared the trees, and already his hands were raw. Edric had lost track of how many furrows he'd carved before the sun finally breached the tree line. When it came, it was not a welcome glow, but a pale, watchful eye. Too weak to warm and too honest to hide from. It revealed what the dim pre-dawn had only whispered. The cracked earth, still clinging to the last of the winter wetness, the patches of rye that had refused to sprout last season, the tired slope of his field, which he now suspected would erode again come the next storm. He paused, straightened his back slowly, one vertebra at a time, and let out a breath that fogged the cold morning air. His fingers were stiff from gripping the wooden handle of the hoe, the skin beginning to split in familiar places, those thin white lines that never quite healed, just deepened over time like the lines across his brow. He did not look up to admire the sunrise. There was no poetry in it, just more light to work by, more day to get through. Across the road, the sounds of other fields had begun to rise. Iron against stone. A donkey braying in protest as it was yoked to a plough. The call of a woman cursing at a goat that had escaped its pen again. In Henton, mornings unfolded not with orchestras or quiet meditation, but in a rustle of hardship. Buckets sloshing, cloth slapping against washboards, children whining as they were scrubbed with cold water and rough hands. Behind him, down the hill, the smoke had finally begun to curl from the chimney of his own cottage. That meant Alice had coaxed a flame out of wet wood. A small triumph, the kind no one would praise her for, but one she would earn again tomorrow, and the day after that. Edric bent back to the row. The soil here was better, darker, less stone, but still clung in stubborn clumps. He pulled with slow, practiced motions, his body no longer negotiating with pain, but simply accepting it. His legs were already heavy, his shoulders hot beneath the wool of his tunic. It was still early. In the village square, Brother Toman had begun his rounds, walking door to door with his walking stick and his satchel of old bread and bitter herbs. The priest was a man of age and few illusions. He knew better than to speak of heaven too early in the morning, especially to those who still had 12 hours of drudgery ahead. Instead, he greeted with nods, offered blessings like coins no one could spend, and kept moving. He passed Edric's cottage and tipped his head toward Elise, who had stepped outside to shake the soot from a cloth. She did not bow. There was no time for ceremony, not with Bram hollering about a stubbed toe and Lena insisting the chickens had disappeared again. Edric had told her to build the fence higher, but they had no more wood, and even if they did, his hands were full with the field. The chickens, as usual, would have to be found and ushered home like stubborn, feathered children. By mid-morning, Edric's tunic was soaked through with sweat, despite the lingering chill. His muscles had settled into a rhythm not unlike prayer, repetitive, quiet, and never-ending. He paused only once to drink from the leather flask, tied to his belt, its contents more sour than fresh. The water had sat too long in the wooden barrel beside the hut, but it was wet, and that was all that mattered. He let it sit in his mouth for a moment, wishing for even the ghost of mint or honey, then swallowed and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. He looked out across the field and calculated silently. How many more rows until the noon bell? How many seeds left? Was the sun still rising or already beginning to fall? The truth was, it didn't matter. The day would stretch however far it pleased. What mattered was that the work be done before the steward came. The steward, Godric, was due that afternoon. He would arrive on a horse, fat and sleek, its hooves picking disdainfully through the mud. He would wear gloves, even in fair weather, and his beard would be oiled. Godric did not sweat, not visibly. He didn't labor. He counted, measured, tallied. Then he collected. Eggs, grain, flax, sometimes a few pots of honey or a spare chicken if he was feeling greedy. Edric hated him the way one hates rain during harvest, not personally, but as a fact of life that made everything harder. Alice always kept one pot of preserves hidden beneath the floorboards, wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of glass, just in case Godric decided they owed more than they did. Lying to the steward was a sin. So was starving. They chose their sins carefully in Henton. By the time the sun reached its peak and the bells began to ring from the chapel's belfry, a weak, lopsided clang that sounded more like apology than command, Edric's hands trembled when he tried to rest them at his sides. His stomach growled, though he doubted much waited at home. Alice might have saved him a crust of barley bread, maybe spread with fat from last week's duck bones if any remained. If not, he would eat gruel again and be glad for it. Still he turned back to the last row. Half finished, he could not go home with it looking like that. The villagers might not judge him, but the land would, and the land remembered. So he dug again, bent again, and prayed only that his knees would last until evening. Not for rest. Rest would not come. There was firewood to gather, the pen to repair, the thatch to be checked. But evening brought silence, and sometimes silence brought peace. Sometimes. By the time Edric returned to the cottage, his limbs felt borrowed, heavy in a way that no longer alarmed him, but simply reminded him of time. Each step was more negotiation than movement. The mud clung to his boots like an accusation, and the dry wind tugged at the edge of his hood, reminding him that spring in Henton never arrived easily. The sky was bright, but not warm. The sun gave light, not kindness. He paused at the low wooden door of the cottage, bent his head under the threshold, and stepped inside. The familiar dimness greeted him like a second skin. The hearth was no warmer than when he had left, but something was bubbling in the pot, something that smelled of turnips, barley, and the ghost of salted broth. His stomach tightened with expectation, though his body knew better than to hope for fullness. Alice looked up from the hearth, but said nothing. Words at this hour were like coins, useful only when needed. She handed him a wooden bowl with a chipped edge and turned back to the fire. The children were outside, likely chasing the hens or playing in the dirt beside the sheep pen. Their laughter was faint, tucked into the hum of village life. Someone hammering 2 doors down, a distant argument near the communal well, the clatter of a pail falling. Edric sat heavily on the stool by the wall, balanced the bowl on his knee, and began to eat. The food was hot, which was enough. It softened the ache behind his ribs, even if only for a moment. He didn't ask what was in it. He didn't need to. Everything in the pot had been there yesterday, and the day before that, stirred and stretched until flavor was a memory more than a presence. After the meal, or what passed for it, there was no pause, no moment of digestion. The field still needed mending at its north end, where the last rains had collapsed the row's edge into a shallow, useless ditch. Edric stood, joints crackling, and reached for the wicker basket by the door. It held 4 new fence posts and a coil of thick twine, coarse and rough with ash. He would carry them back alone, plant them deep, and brace them with stone if he could find some that hadn't already been dragged into the manor's wall. He nodded once to Alice, who was now scrubbing a wooden bowl with a scrap of old linen and rainwater, and stepped back into the day. The sunlight had shifted, warmer now, but only by degrees. The air still carried the scent of dung and old bread and wet wood. Nothing sweet, nothing to remember. As he made his way down the hill, the sound of hooves interrupted the usual rhythm. Edric froze for a moment, glancing over his shoulder. It was Godric, the steward, just as he had expected. The man rode in like wind across dry wheat, quick, sharp, and impossible to ignore. His cloak was trimmed with fur, though it hung more for vanity than warmth, and his boots gleamed as though they'd never touched mud in their lives. Edric stepped aside, lowered his head slightly, not out of deference, but calculation, and waited for the steward to pass. Godric didn't stop, not yet. He rode past the square, past Edric's cottage, and toward the chapel where he always began his circuit with a hollow gesture of prayer. By late afternoon, he'd return with parchment and pen, tallying eggs, sacks, skins, and souls. Edric swallowed hard and kept walking. He had little to offer, too little. He would find something to give before sunset, even if it meant skipping his own bread for the next 2 days. The northern end of the field was worse than he remembered. The soil had slumped inward where the fence had once held the edge, and a small stream now trickled through it where none should be. He stared at it for a long moment, basket at his feet, and exhaled slowly. This was not a task to finish in one afternoon. It might take 3, but he began anyway. He pulled the first post from the basket, drove it into the ground with a flat stone, and began winding twine with fingers already bleeding from the splinters of the handle. The wind had picked up again, bringing with it the sharp, dry scent of distant smoke. Someone was burning something not quite dry. The sun inched lower. He worked faster. By the time the bell tolled again, 3 slow clangs that marked the start of Vespers, his arms were shaking. The fence was not finished, but it stood better than it had. Edric dropped the twine, wiped the sweat from his brow with a corner of his tunic, and gathered the remaining tools into the basket. The stream still trickled, but the posts held firm. It would do for now. He turned back toward home, back up the slope, toward the thin column of smoke, now curling once more from his chimney. The village looked smaller in the evening light, almost kind, but Edric knew better. Henton never gave without taking more. And the day, though ending, had not finished its demands just yet. When Edric reached the cottage, the sky had already begun to shift. Not in colour, there was no dramatic sunset over Henton, no brilliant farewell of oranges or purples, but in mood. The air had cooled just enough that breath lingered longer. The sounds changed too. The clatter of tools became the scrape of bowls. The bleating of goats dulled to restless murmurs. A few shutters closed with tired hands behind them. The village exhaled, not in relief but in resignation. It was not done working, only done pretending it had more strength left to give. He paused at the threshold and let the basket drop gently onto the hard earth. His hands throbbed, not with sharp pain, but with that deep, tired ache that travelled all the way up the arm and settled into the back like a reminder of every stone ever lifted. He flexed his fingers slowly, and bits of dried twine fell from between the cracks in his skin. Under his nails, dirt, blood, and something greenish from the thistles he hadn't seen in the ditch. He wiped his hands on his tunic, knowing it would do no good. He looked out over the path once more. Godric had already passed back through, the trail of hoofprints marking his journey, but Edric hadn't seen him again. That was either a small mercy or a delay in reckoning. Either way, it would come. Inside, the cottage glowed with a weak fire, coaxed back from the morning's ashes. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was company. Alice sat by the hearth with her legs folded beneath her, weaving new handles onto an old basket. Her face was flushed from the heat, strands of hair clinging to her cheek. Lena was stirring the pot with solemn concentration, and Bram lay half asleep in the corner, his thumb in his mouth and one foot sticking out from beneath the wool scrap that passed for a blanket. Edric ducked inside and closed the door with care. Not out of delicacy, but because the hinges had begun to groan like an old man whenever rushed. It was the kind of sound that lingered in the bones. He didn't want that noise right now. He moved to his usual stool, the one closest to the fire but far enough from the smoke path that his eyes didn't sting. Alice didn't look up, but she reached out with one foot and nudged a clay cup toward him. Water, or the closest thing to it. It tasted faintly of wood and dust, but it cooled the heat in his throat. He drank it slowly, not because he savoured it, but because there was no rush. Nothing waited for him but sleep, and sleep came slow. They ate in silence, as they always did in the evening. Lena ladled out portions with quiet hands, careful not to spill, careful to give the illusion of fairness even when there wasn't enough. Tonight, the stew was thicker than expected. Someone must have traded a marrow bone from the butcher's scraps, or perhaps Elise had scraped something extra from her drying rack. Whatever it was, it coated the tongue and clung to the throat, warm and salty and stubborn. Edric swallowed it with effort, but it stayed in his belly, which was more than he'd asked for. He didn't speak. Words wasted heat. After supper, the children cleared the bowls and laid them by the door to be rinsed in the morning. Bram whined about splinters, and Lena rolled her eyes the way older sisters do in every century. Alice hushed them both with a glance, and the room returned to its low hum. Edric stood slowly and reached for the sharpening stone, rubbing it against his sickle in the same pattern he always did. Long, slow circles like prayer, like apology. The blade wasn't dull yet, but it would be soon. Better to sharpen before it failed. He worked with the stone for a while. the scraping rhythm blending with the soft crackle of the fire, the shuffle of Alice folding cloth, and the muffled sniffles of Bram drifting into sleep. Outside, someone was singing. A woman, maybe 2 cottages over. The voice was low, almost more vibration than melody. A lullaby meant more for the singer's comfort than the child's. The song carried no words Edric recognized. Maybe Latin, maybe older, maybe it didn't matter. It was a sound of trying to keep something gentle alive in a world where everything had edges. The song faded after a few minutes, or maybe it was covered by the wind. Either way, it left a space behind it, one that filled slowly with the sounds of creaking beams and tired breathing. Alice set down her weaving and leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed. Her hands rested in her lap, still stained with dirt at the creases. She looked not peaceful, but paused, like a moment between heartbeats. Edric watched her for a moment, then turned back to the sickle. One last pass with the stone, a soft wipe with cloth, then it returned to its hook on the wall. Above it hung a bundle of dried herbs, good for tea, Alice said, though it never seemed to taste like much. Next to that, an old wooden spoon, blackened from use, and a cracked plate they kept not for use but for memory. Alice's mother had given it to her when she married, and though it had long since split in 2, she refused to throw it away. In a life where so much was taken, some things were held tight, no matter how broken. The fire dimmed as the logs collapsed into coals. Lena curled beside Bram on the pallet, her arm draped over his chest, her braid undone. Edric laid down his cloak across their legs, more out of habit than warmth. Then he turned and lowered himself slowly onto his own bed, if it could be called that. Alice followed without a word. She climbed in beside him, pulled the blanket over them both, and settled against the curve of his back. The straw mattress crunched beneath their weight. The smell of smoke, sweat, and boiled barley clung to everything. Edric closed his eyes. Outside, the village whispered. A barn door thudded closed. A distant dog barked once, then silence, the kind that only came when everything else had already been spent. Tomorrow would be the same, perhaps harder, perhaps wetter. Perhaps there would be blisters, or news from the manor, or something stolen, or someone ill. But not yet, not tonight. Tonight they had finished what they could, and in Henton that was the closest thing to peace anyone could afford. Even in sleep, Edric did not rest. His body may have stilled beneath the threadbare blanket, but his mind remained entangled in lists, in rhythms, in the heavy choreography of a life too full to pause. He did not dream of escape, nor of comfort. Those were luxuries of minds unburdened by rationing and weather and obligation. Instead, his half-sleep filled with ghosts of unfinished tasks, the sag in the thatch above the eastern wall, the hens roosting low in their coop, easy prey for foxes, the lingering ache in his right foot from the stone he'd stepped on 2 weeks ago that had never quite healed. Each of these flickered behind closed eyes like embers refusing to die out. He shifted once in the dark, quietly, so as not to wake Alice. Her hand was draped across his chest, palm open, fingers slack. Even in unconsciousness, she did not let go. It was still dark when the stirrings began again, not from inside, but beyond the door. Hoofbeats, distant and slow, followed by a pair of muffled voices. Edric held his breath, his ears tuning to the rhythm of it. Not raiders, not soldiers, no alarm in the voices. Probably travelers arriving late and seeking space at the chapel's lean-to, or perhaps a visiting steward from another village making his round of tally and extraction. Either way, it did not matter. They would leave him with less, as all visitors did. Still, he did not rise. Instead, he let the sounds fade into the cold again, where they became part of the village's natural music, the creak of beams, the rustle of sleeping livestock, the whimper of a dreaming child. Eventually his eyes drifted closed again, though no peace followed. When morning finally arrived, it was not with birdsong or light, but with the wet slap of wind against the thatch and the unmistakable groan of wood shifting under weather. Rain. Not heavy, not violent, but steady. The kind that turned footpaths into sucking mud, the kind that dampened the inside of cloaks even when worn tight. Edric sat up with a grunt, reached for the bundle of fabric he called a tunic, and pulled it over his head in one practiced motion. It smelled faintly of sweat and old ash. He did not flinch. He only stood, checked the basket beside the door, and ran his hands through his hair to flatten it into a semblance of order. Alice was already awake, crouched beside the hearth, coaxing flame from damp kindling using a sliver of last night's coal. Her shoulders hunched inward against the chill, her fingers blue at the tips. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Their day had begun, and the rain would not wait. Behind her, the children stirred beneath the shared cloak, their small bodies still too young to greet the morning without resistance. Bram mumbled something about bread. Lena hushed him softly, pulling the fabric tighter. Edric gave them both a glance, stern but not unkind, then turned and stepped out into the rain. The sky was a dull sheet of grey that stretched from one end of the village to the other. The air was thick with the scent of wet straw, manure and wood smoke already curling from every chimney in protest. He made his way toward the storage hut near the southern edge of the field, his boots sinking slightly into the mud with every step. The fence he had mended 2 days before sagged visibly now. The twine was soaked through, and one of the new posts had begun to lean. He'd need to drive a stone brace in later. For now, the priority was the granary. The hut's door resisted his push at first, swollen with damp, but eventually gave way with a loud creak. Inside, the scent of old grain greeted him, pungent, sharp, and earthy. Several sacks lay stacked in the corner, each tied with fraying rope. He checked each one carefully, pressing his hands along their seams, scanning for signs of moisture, mold, or infestation. Grain was not wealth in Henton, it was survival. If the rain had seeped in, if the sacks were ruined, there would be no bread next month, no trade, no leverage, and no mercy from Godric when the next tally was due. Satisfied, or at least reassured, Edric retied the sacks and closed the door with more force than he meant to. The latch stuck again. Another repair to add to the list. By the time he returned to the cottage, Alice had set out 2 bowls of pottage, thinner today, but hot. The children had dressed and were now huddled near the hearth, sharing a crude woolen shawl, while Bram whittled a stick into something that might one day resemble a toy. Edric sat, ate, and did not speak. He listened to the rain against the roof, each drop a soft percussion. The day would be spent indoors now, mostly. But there was always work. The tools needed sharpening. The chicken coop still had a broken hinge. The thatch needed checking before it leaked. There were always holes to mend, always something giving way to time, to weather, to gravity. Later that morning, a knock came at the door. Not a frantic pounding, but a short, firm rhythm. Edric rose slowly, motioned to Alice to stay seated, and unlatched the door. Standing in the rain was a boy of maybe 10 winters, soaked to the skin and holding a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. It was from the manor, a message, or perhaps a request. The boy spoke quickly, almost too quickly to understand, but the words that landed were clear. Lady Mira wanted rushes for the hall floor replaced by week's end. The old ones had soured, and the steward would be back to collect them soon. Edric stared for a long moment, then nodded. The boy turned and left, no thanks offered. None expected. He closed the door slowly and leaned against it for a breath. So now, on top of field and fence and food, there were rushes to gather. The marsh was a half-day's walk, even on dry ground. In this rain, it would be worse. and there would be leeches, thorns, and the risk of slipping into the bog. But if he refused? If he delivered too few or too late? There were punishments for that. Fines, lashes, or worse, his turn on the tax roll increased by coin or crop. They didn't need more debt. So he would go, maybe not today, maybe not alone, but he would go. He turned back to the room, to the flicker of firelight on the wall, to Alice already measuring dried beans and Lena brushing bits of straw from the floor with a bundle of old twigs. The day had not even reached its midpoint, and already it had made its demands. Edric sat again, reached for the whetstone, and began to drag it slowly across the sickle's curve. The same motion, the same weight, the same tired grace. The rain did not stop. It was still raining when Edric left the cottage again. The stew had barely warmed his stomach, and his back ached from the previous day's fence work, but there was no room for delay. Rushes were needed by the week's end, and there would be no sympathy for mud, cold, or fatigue. The manor demanded, and the village yielded. That was the rhythm. That had always been the rhythm. He wore his thickest cloak, one that had once belonged to his father, and smelled of mildew and old sheep, but even it sagged beneath the rain's weight. The fabric drank water like a dying man, and Edric knew he'd be soaked through long before he reached the marsh. Still, he tied the strap of the bundle across his chest, tucked his knife into his belt, and kissed Alice on the forehead before stepping once more into the grey. The path to the marsh was not a road so much as a memory of one, a thin ribbon of trampled earth winding between hedgerows and low hills. The wheels of countless carts had carved furrows into it, and today each was a small river. Edric's boots sank into the muck with every step. The effort it took to lift them again reminded him of his own body's heaviness and of how easily the land claimed what walked on it. As he climbed the low ridge that marked the halfway point, he paused to catch his breath. His hair clung to his forehead. His hands were raw from gripping the rush hook handle too tightly. Rain slid down his temples and into his ears, a steady invasion that blurred the line between skin and storm. He squinted into the distance. The marsh stretched out before him in a dull sprawl of brown and green, speckled with standing pools and stands of coarse grass that waved like bedraggled flags in the wind. It was not a welcoming place, but neither was home. At least here, the wind did not carry the sound of children's coughs or Godric's pen scratching on debt parchment. He descended the slopes slowly, using a bent stick for balance. The rain made everything treacherous. Rocks turned to glass, roots to traps. More than once, he slipped and caught himself on hands, already scraped from farm work. The marsh greeted him with a hiss, a soft, constant sound of wetness, of frogs calling from unseen puddles, of insects stirred from damp nests. The air here was thicker, humid despite the chill. He could smell rot, old reeds, dead fish, something sour and indistinct. It wasn't foul enough to gag, but it lingered in the back of the throat like smoke. He trudged through the shallow pools toward a stand of rushes he'd harvested before. They were tall, yellowing at the base, but still firm. Good enough for floor covering. He took out the hook and began to cut. Each swing was slow and deliberate. The rushes resisted with a soft crackle, falling in bundles that he tied together with twine from his belt. He worked with the same rhythm he used in the field, the same mindless, necessary pace. Work until it's done, then do more. Rain ran down his sleeves and into his tunic. His fingers numbed. Mosquitoes landed on his face, indifferent to the weather, and bit without apology. He didn't swat them, it would only waste energy. Instead, he worked. Time in the marsh didn't move like it did in the village. There were no bells here, no voices, no triangle from the chapel tower. Only the sound of his own breath and the cut of the hook, again and again. The pile of rushes at his feet grew, slow and soggy, but he needed more. The manor hall was large, and the steward would count the bundles by eye and by mood. Too few, and Edric's name would rise higher on the punishment list. So he gathered more. By the time he stood upright again, the rushes bundled and tied, his body felt strange, emptied, but also full of something unfamiliar. Not pride, not even the satisfaction of a task complete, just the echo of movement. He dragged the bundles toward the edge of the marsh and looked back once. The place was already swallowing his footprints. The water lapped gently at the holes he'd made, erasing the evidence of labor as though it had never happened. That was how it always was. Work, and the land forgets. The walk home was slower. The weight of the rushes dragged at his shoulders, and the wind had grown sharper, cutting sideways beneath his cloak and chilling the sweat on his back. He shifted the bundle from one side to the other every few hundred steps, though each motion scraped against his spine and sent dull sparks of pain down his thighs. His hands gripped the rope tight. He did not stop to rest. Stopping made it harder to start again. So he moved, one step, then another. The village greeted him with the same indifference it always did. No one was outside to see him return. The rain had driven even the most desperate indoors. Only the smoke from the chimneys acknowledged his arrival. That, and the soft creak of his own door when he finally pushed it open. Alice was at the hearth, her back to him. She turned at the sound, her face drawn but dry. She had lit the second lamp, and the room glowed faintly, warmly, like a place meant to hold people, not just their burdens. She took one look at the bundle, then moved forward without a word, untying the rope and setting it aside to dry. Edric stripped off the soaked cloak and sat on the stool. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, not even from cold, from effort, prolonged and unpaid. Bram ran to him, hugged his knee. Lena offered a cup of broth. Edric drank it slowly, letting it soothe the rawness in his throat. The room was still small, still cold, still lined with things broken or borrowed. But he was home, and the rushes were gathered. He would rest tonight. Not because the work was done, work was never done, but because the body, finally, insisted on it. That night, the fire burned longer than usual, not from indulgence, but because the rain had returned in sheets, heavier now, like a punishment for something unnamed. The wind whistled through the cracks in the doorframe, bending the flames sideways and stirring ash onto the hearthstone. Alice had fed the fire with the last of the dry kindling, saved under the eaves for weeks exactly for a night like this. It would have to be replaced by morning, and Edric knew it would be him who gathered it, rain or not. But for now, he let his eyes rest on the dance of the flame, that lazy flicker of gold and smoke that made even this hut feel less like a cage and more like a corner of something known. Alice sat opposite him, spinning flax into thread between her fingers. Her motions were slow, half asleep, guided by routine more than attention. The spinning wasn't for trade, it would barely produce enough for a single patch on Lena's shift. But it was work, and that meant it had to be done. The rhythm of her hands mirrored Edric's own movements earlier that day, cutting, bundling, returning, and somewhere between those mirrored tasks they shared something older than speech. Neither had spoken much since his return. They didn't need to. Their silences were not empty. They were full of understanding of aches too similar to require explanation. The children had gone quiet, finally, their bodies piled together beneath the cloak by the fire. Bram still sniffled now and again, a mild cold he'd likely had for weeks, but the fever had passed. Lena had curled around him like a shield, her face pressed into the crook of her brother's shoulder. She was old enough to remember her own colds, to remember being comforted, and old enough to know it was her turn now to offer comfort in kind. Edric watched them for a while, not with sentiment, but with something more complex: worry, guilt, and a dull pride that carried no joy, only recognition. They were alive, they were growing, and the work he did, the cold endured, the rushes gathered. It had bought them one more day to be those things. A knock at the door broke the stillness. It was soft, hesitant, not a steward's knock, not authority. Edric stood and opened it with care, revealing a hunched figure wrapped in a patched wool shawl. It was May, the widow who lived near the far end of the village with her grown daughter, and a spinning wheel too damaged to sell. She looked up at him with pale, wet eyes, one hand gripping a clay pot, and the other shielding her face from the wind. "Stew," she said simply. "Too much for just us tonight." Edric nodded, stepped aside and let her enter. No thanks passed between them. In Henton, giving was a form of saving. If you had extra, you gave it, because next week you would not. And when you needed help, help came only to those who had once given it. It was not charity. It was survival arranged in loops, a system older than the chapel and far more reliable. May moved to the hearth, ladled a few scoops of her stew into their pot, and left just as quietly, her shawl flapping behind her like wings too tired to lift. The scent she left behind was strong: carrot, lentil, and something gamey, likely squirrel. Alice stirred the pot gently, folding the new stew into the old, and served what remained into 4 uneven bowls. Edric took his without protest. It wasn't warmth, exactly, but it was depth. The flavor carried the strange echo of a neighbor's care, and somehow that made it richer. Later, as the coals dimmed and the wind softened, the sounds of the village settled into their night forms. A baby cried from somewhere far off, a chicken clucked indignantly, and footsteps padded quickly past their door. Probably one of Toman's apprentices on some errand or mischief. The air inside was still, heavy with smoke, stew, and old sweat. But no one complained. It was thicker than the cold outside, and that alone made it valuable. Edric lay back on the straw mat and exhaled. The pain in his shoulders had become dull and constant, like background music to every motion. His feet ached from within the bone, and one of his thumbs had begun to swell slightly where the twine had bitten in too deep during the rush gathering. He knew what that meant. Infection maybe, nothing to do for it yet. Perhaps Alice would wrap it in honey and cloth if it worsened. Perhaps it would pass. Either way, he would still use that hand tomorrow. Beside him, Alice unwrapped her hair and let it fall in waves across her shoulder. She reached behind her back and unhooked the belt she'd worn since midday, the gesture so practiced it looked like thought-given form. She stretched once, then curled into his side, her head resting just beneath his chin. He placed his arm around her automatically, and together they let their breathing fall into the same slow cadence. Outside, the rain tapered off, the wind stilled, and Henton once again became a place between times, not quite asleep, not yet awake. Somewhere in the darkness, a bell chimed, one soft note, perhaps an accident, or perhaps the priest sleepwalking through duty. Edric heard it but did not move. The day was over. Another would begin soon, but for now, this breath, this weight of another's warmth, this ceiling above and fire below, these were enough for tonight. The wind had quieted, the rain had passed, but sleep still hovered far from Edric, as it often did when his limbs were too tired for motion, but not tired enough to forget. The cottage was silent now, save for the soft exhale of the coals and the rhythmic breathing of his family. Alice pressed close, Bram mumbling in his dreams, Lena snoring faintly beneath the cloak near the hearth. The stillness did not comfort Edric the way it once had in his youth, when silence meant safety and a closed door meant security. Now it merely offered a space large enough for thought to wander freely. And thought for a peasant in a world ruled by harvests, seasons, and the fickle hand of those who owned the land was not always a gentle companion. He stared at the low ceiling, its beams darkened by years of smoke, cobwebs thick in the corners. In the moonlight slanting through the single shuttered window, he could see the faint glimmer of soot on the rafters, the dull gleam of the iron hook where they once hung salted fish, back when the catch from the nearby stream was more generous and before the Lord's new decree had reclassified even that stream as under the manor's dominion. Now to take fish from it without permission was theft. Edric had not fished since, not openly. He had sons to raise and debts to avoid, and the steward's punishments rarely fit the crimes. Even so, the thought of that hook sometimes made his mouth water with the memory of oil-slicked skin and crisped edges, the taste of something once caught and cooked under the same roof in a moment that had felt like reward. He shifted slightly, careful not to wake Elise, and let his mind drift to the villagers he had not seen that day. Old Bren, for instance, whose twisted foot had made walking nearly impossible since the last frost. Edric hadn't spotted him by the well or outside the latrines. Perhaps he'd taken to his bed, or perhaps worse. Bren was never a man of many words, but he'd once shared a trick for knotting twine that Edric still used. A small thing, but in Henton, small things carried weight. Or May and her daughter, had they truly made enough stew to share, or had they scraped their own pot for the sake of keeping ties strong? It was not charity, no, but it was a risk. And it was a kind of love, the kind this place allowed. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, short, sharp, then silence. Edric listened harder but heard nothing else, likely nothing, but still he rose slowly, gently lifting Alice's arm from his chest, and stood barefoot on the straw-patched floor. His tunic was damp still, but he pulled it tighter and crossed the room to the shutter. He opened it a crack and peered outside. The village lay hushed beneath a blanket of mist. The air was damp and sharp, filled with the scent of moss, stone, and the last echo of rain. The road through the village glistened like a ribbon of pewter. He saw no movement, just roof lines leaning into one another like old men sharing secrets, the low outline of the chapel in the distance, and the faintest gleam of oil lamplight behind the smithy's shutter. Perhaps someone else like him could not sleep. He closed the shutter, quietly latched it, and turned back. His legs ached from standing, from moving, from existing. Yet, even as he lowered himself again onto the pallet, his thoughts did not fade. They turned inward toward questions he did not often allow himself to ask. How long could he keep going? How long before the aches did not leave? Before Bram grew too fast for the food to keep up? Before Lene learned the way the steward's eyes lingered on young girls and how quickly innocence could curdle into barter? He looked to Alice again. She had turned onto her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, lips parted slightly in sleep. Her hair had slipped free from its braid. Even now, after a day as cruel and ordinary as any, she looked steady, grounded, like something that might outlast the timber of the hut. Edric reached out and touched her shoulder softly, just once, not to wake her, just to remember that she was warm, alive, still here, and that he was too. Faith had once offered comfort, long ago when he was still small enough to be lifted onto his father's shoulders to see the altar candles. Now it offered structure, not hope. The bell that marked the Angelus reminded him to pause. The Sunday procession offered a moment off from the field. But true comfort? That came from the firelight on his daughter's cheek, the feel of wood, smooth from years of sharpening, the steady thud of his own heart beneath the layers of linen and weariness. Eventually his eyes grew heavier, not from peace, but from sheer depletion. The body was wiser than the mind when it came to surrender. He pulled the blanket higher over his chest, turned toward Alice, and allowed the darkness to settle around him, not like a blanket, but like a lid. Outside, the mist thickened, curling against the walls of every hut in Henton, muffling the night into a slow, wet silence. Somewhere an owl called once and was answered. The clouds above shifted but did not break. Sleep came at last, not soft, not complete, but enough. Dawn, when it finally arrived, did not pour into the room like gold through cathedral glass, nor lift the darkness with song. It bled in slowly, grey and unsentimental, prying at the edges of the shutter like a tax collector tapping at a debtor's door. The light wasn't bright. It rarely was in Henton this time of year, but it was firm, insistent, and absolute. The kind of light that didn't ask for permission or offer warmth, just commanded rise. The fire had long since gone to ash, and the room, like the people in it, stirred only reluctantly. Edric was awake before he moved. He lay in that narrow gap between sleep and obligation, listening to the creak of the beams overhead, to the slow stretching groan of Ali's turning beside him, to the steady patter of small footsteps overhead. No, not above, just behind. Lena was awake too, brushing down her shift and reaching for the pitcher near the hearth. She was quiet, practiced. At 10 winters, she had already learned how to navigate the morning without noise. Childhood didn't stretch far in places like this. It narrowed early into necessity. Edric sat up slowly. Every joint protested. Not sharply, he'd had sharp pains before, after accidents with ploughs and once a fall from a wet ladder, but in that deep, dull way that told of tired sinew and overused muscle, of work done not once, but thousands of times. His neck cracked audibly as he turned toward the hearth. Alice had already thrown a shawl over her shoulders and was crouched low, gently stirring embers back into life. The tip of her nose was red from cold. Her hair, though still braided, had loosened at the ends, trailing into her face like moss creeping from a stone. "Rushes'll need to dry more," she said simply, nodding toward the pile beside the door. "Can't deliver them wet." Edric grunted an agreement. There was no time to argue about what must be done. The steward would be by on the morrow to inspect them. And if they weren't ready, if they were too damp, or too short, or too few, the price would fall not in reprimands, but in real, measurable cost. Less bread next week, a higher tally at the year's reckoning, perhaps even the forced loan of Bram to the Reeves barn for a month to carry and clean and sleep beside beasts. All possibilities dangled quietly between them as they dressed, not spoken aloud, but present in every glance, every choice. The pottage from last night had congealed into a thick, gummy paste, but it was warm once stirred, and that was enough. Lena ate quickly, chewing without comment. Bram was slower, sleepy-eyed, his head bobbing slightly over the bowl until Alice gave him a nudge. Edric sat near the shutter, cracking it open just enough to see the sky. Overcast again, low clouds like sodden wool clinging to the hilltops. But the wind had shifted eastward, a drying wind if it held. That might be enough to save the rushes. He stood, wrapped his belt twice around his tunic to hold in the warmth, and reached for the shoulder yoke hanging beside the door. Today's task was not field work, not harvesting or mending. It was collection. The woodpile needed rebuilding, and the barley sacks, mildewed though they were, had to be aired and beaten clean of mites. If the weather broke, he would haul the sacks to the chapel yard, where the stone wall offered just enough sun to bake them slightly dry. The path to the yard passed directly by the manor gate, and he hated that. Not just for the risk of being seen, but because it forced him to look at what his labour maintained, yet what he would never touch. He stepped outside into the day. The air carried the scent of wet bark and trampled hay, and the road was slick underfoot. His boots had not dried fully from the marsh work, and as he walked, the damp chafed the backs of his heels raw. Each step was its own small price. He passed the cottage of Renna the dyer, her doorway marked with a cross of soot, likely a sign to ward off last week's illness, which had taken 2 of her lambs and nearly her husband. She glanced up from her stool as Edric passed, but did not speak. They exchanged nods. That was enough. The chapel yard was quiet when he reached it, save for Brother Toman speaking low to one of the Reeves' sons. Toman's robes were patched and worn, but his voice held its usual slow certainty. Edric did not interrupt. He moved to the side wall, unrolled the sacks onto the stones, and began to beat them with a flat paddle. The sound echoed whap 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 like a lazy drum. Dust rose in slow clouds. Tiny black insects crawled away from the seams. He worked steadily, never rushing. Speed ruined sacks. Between blows he glanced at the manor. Its stone walls rose confidently from the earth, topped with red tile and flanked by a narrow turret that served no defensive purpose but to remind the village who owned the view. A window on the 3rd level opened slightly, and a length of linen fluttered from within, perhaps a curtain, perhaps a signal. Edric looked away. He had no interest in who watched from there. He had only to make sure the rushes dried, the sacks were clean, the firewood replaced. The manor would always be above him. The weight of it, like the sky, pressed down with the authority of permanence. Later, as the sun, faint though it was, climbed toward its peak, he returned to the cottage with his arms full. The sacks were lighter now, less damp, their contents rattling dryly. Alice was out back, mending a fence post with one hand and balancing Bram with the other. Lena had gathered 3 eggs, rare and precious, and held them in her apron as if carrying glass. Edric looked at them and smiled, a real thing, brief but true. That night, perhaps they would eat soft-boiled eggs, perhaps the children would smile too. As he stepped inside, setting the sacks near the hearth to rest, he caught sight of the rushes again. They were drying, slowly but enough. Another day of wind and they'd be ready. Just in time. He exhaled and sat down, pulling off his boots. Steam rose faintly from his socks. His hands were shaking, not with effort, but with something worse, anticipation. Always the next task, always the weight of what hadn't yet gone wrong. Alice entered soon after and rested her forehead against his. They did not kiss, they did not speak, but they leaned together briefly, long enough to remember they were not alone in the labor. And then the bell rang, signaling the evening grain apportioning at the village square. Edric rose, tucked his shirt into his belt, and went back into the chill. The bell was never loud. It did not ring like a church bell, nor command like the manor horn. It was dull, flat, made of iron, too thin to carry far, and too pitted with rust to sing clearly. And yet, everyone in Henton heard it, not because it rang out, but because they were trained to hear it. Like the snap of dry branches beneath a predator's foot, or the subtle shift in the wind that meant a change in weather. It was the kind of sound that bent heads and summoned feet, because behind that bell came the sack, and behind the sack came the scale, and behind the scale came the memory of winters when there had not been enough. Edric made his way toward the village square slowly, the soles of his feet aching with each step. The ground had begun to dry under the eastward wind, and the path was no longer mud, but hardening into uneven clumps. Each step jarred up through his legs into his hips, his spine. But he did not slow. Already he could see others gathering, May with her daughter, old Bren hobbling with the help of a stick twice his height, the Reeves brother who carried the ledger, flanked by 2 boys barely of age, but already bearing the red sash of manor apprentices. At the center of the square stood the scale. It was a simple thing, a beam balanced on a crossbar with 2 rusted pans hanging from chains. One side held the standard weight, the other, your portion. The Reeves brother measured, the steward's apprentice watched, and the village lined up, each with their marked slip, a piece of cloth bearing a color thread that told the tale of their owed labor, their standing debt, and the size of their household. There were no negotiations, there were no explanations, there were only nods, sacks opened, scoops lifted, grain poured. Edric waited his turn in silence, his arms crossed over his chest, more for containment than warmth. Around him, murmurs drifted like fog. 2 hands short in our field this week. Heard the steward counted Raoul's goat as tax. The priest won't lend the shovel again, not after Joss left it rusted. Tiny stories of failure, of small unfairnesses repeated in whispers so soft they couldn't be punished. He did not add to them, he only listened. He learned more that way. When his turn came, he stepped forward, handed over his cloth marker, dyed with 2 blue knots and 1 red, the sign of a full household with 2 able-bodied workers and children under 10. The steward's apprentice glanced at it, then at Edric. Their eyes met. The boy was no older than Lean would be in a few years. Pale, narrow, skin barely touched by work. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the scoop. 10 measures, the Reeves brother announced flatly. And no more. The scoop dipped into the sack. Edric watched the arc of grain as it rose, poured, measured. It fell into his burlap bag like rain. Soft, brief, vanishingly light. 1 scoop, 2, 3. He counted in his head, not out of distrust, but to stay present. When the 10th landed, he nodded once. Not thanks, not submission, just acknowledgement. He tied the bag, closed himself, and stepped aside. Behind him, Alice approached with her own cloth. The steward had long insisted that wives appear separately, even though the cloths were linked, even though it added nothing. It was about show, about ensuring each pair of hands stood visible. She did not look at Edric as she passed. She looked ahead, jaw set, her marker held tightly in fingers, rough from years of scouring pots and grinding herbs. Her portion was smaller, 4 measures, but she didn't flinch as it was poured. They met again near the far edge of the square, just past the well. No words passed between them. They shifted their loads into shared sacks and began the walk home. Along the way, Edric saw what he always saw on grain day, the faces of reckoning. Some wore relief, the kind that only came from having made it through another cycle. Others wore worry, counting mouths against handfuls. Some, mostly the very old or those without kin, wore something harder to name. Not despair, but resignation, as if the world had moved on from them and left them standing, still hungry. Back home, Alice measured the grain into their earthenware bin, smoothing the top with her hand. "Tight this month," she murmured. Edric didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew how to stretch, knew the tricks, mixing barley with chaff to make porridge, soaking grain longer to make it seem thicker, flavoring thin stews with wild garlic or onions pulled too young. He'd watched his mother do it, watched Alice do it. Soon, Lenny would learn too. As the day wore on, he busied himself with the task of breaking apart the old kindling behind the cottage. Each snap of wood echoed the snapping lines in his palms, the seams that cracked deeper each winter. But it kept his hands warm, his body occupied. Rest, when it came, was better earned through fatigue than taken in idleness. The mind, when still, remembered too much. Later, they dined on oatcakes cooked over the hearth and a small ladle of lentils, sweetened with a pinch of honey Alice had bartered for with spare wool. The children ate first, then the parents, as always. Evening came slowly, softened by smoke and the low, golden glow of firelight against the cottage walls. Lena practiced her letters in the soot with a stick, drawing the same shape over and over, a crooked E. Bram had fallen asleep curled against Edric's side, his breath tickling through the worn fabric of his tunic. Alice sat opposite, winding thread again, though slower now, her eyes half-lidded from the long day. There was comfort in the quiet, even if the comfort was small. And then from the far end of the square came a bell. But not the grain bell, not the chapel bell either. This one rang 3 times, spaced, slow, deliberate. The steward's summons. Edric and Alice exchanged a look. Someone, somewhere, had been selected. A task, a punishment, a demand. It would be known by morning, but for tonight, it hung in the air like a splintered breath, unanswered. The bell's echo still hung in the air when Edric stepped outside. He stood just past the threshold, bare feet planted in the hardening dirt, eyes turned toward the village square. He didn't need to ask Alice what she thought. The look they'd shared before he rose said everything. 3 tolls. Not the usual 2 of announcement, not the single ring of warning. 3 was rare. 3 meant an assignment. Someone in the village had been chosen, either for a task too unpleasant for the apprentices, or a punishment veiled as a duty of loyalty. Sometimes it was both. The square itself was empty, save for the shifting shadows of those like Edric, who had emerged from their huts to listen, not yet willing to approach. He saw shapes in the distance, a boy leading an ox by rope, someone standing behind the woodpile near the smithy, a pair of women whispering near the well. No one moved toward the manor yet. That would be too eager. Better to wait. Let the steward send his boy. Let the summons come with a name attached. Until then, there was still plausible unawareness. Edric lingered a few moments more, then turned back inside. The warmth of the hearth hadn't faded entirely, but the room felt colder somehow, unsettled. Bram stirred in his sleep, as if the bell had reached him even there. Alice was back on her stool, thread in hand, but she had stopped weaving. Her fingers moved, but the shuttle did not pass through the loom. She was watching the door. "We'll know by morning," Edric said softly. Alice nodded, but her expression didn't change. She resumed the loom's rhythm after a pause, each clack now louder than before. It sounded like denial wrapped in productivity. It was the sound of a woman refusing to wait for fate to name her. They slept that night in pieces, drifting in and out of shallow rest, ears tuned more to footsteps and voices outside than to dreams. Every creak of timber, every shift of wind brought with it the possibility of a knock at the door. But none came. The village remained still, the silence broken only by the usual sounds of livestock, a baby's whimper, and the low groan of the cold. Morning was sullen and windless. Grey again, though the clouds had lifted slightly, revealing the pale suggestion of sun behind them. Edric rose before the children, stretched his limbs until the joints gave their reluctant consent, and stepped outside. The ground was firmer now, no longer thick with rain. Tracks crisscrossed the lane, goat hooves, bare feet, a wheelbarrow's path, but none led to his door. That at least was something. At the square, the manor boy stood beside the scale again, not for grain this time, but as a sign. In his hand was a folded parchment, wax-sealed and heavy with intent. He wasn't speaking, only standing, Behind him, the steward's scribe, an older man named Corwin, made his way between cottages, knocking not to summon, but to deliver a message. That was worse in its own way. When they called your name, you could prepare. When they whispered it at your neighbour's door, you had to wait for the story to return to you second-hand, warped by fear. By midday, the truth made its way to Edric, not from the steward, but from May's daughter, who came to trade a bundle of rushes for fire-starting wool. As she handed it over, her voice dropped low, the way children speak when mimicking the seriousness of adults. "It's Rawl," they picked Rawl, said he didn't pay his measure last moon. He's to dig the new midden trench by the manor hall. Edric's stomach tightened. That wasn't a task. That was punishment. Digging midden was worse than ditch work, worse than wall repair. It was degrading, and everyone knew it. The smell, the exposure, the constant presence of rot and vermin. It marked you, not just with stench, but with memory. Children who did it stopped being seen as children. Men who did it stopped being asked to share meals. It wasn't banishment, it was erasure by shame. Rawl had been careless, a late measure. Maybe a misunderstanding, or maybe he'd tried to hide a sack of grain for his sister's wedding. It didn't matter now, he'd been named. The bell had tolled for him. That evening, Edric watched from his doorway as Rawl passed by, shovel in hand, head down. His face was blank, but his pace was slow, deliberate, like someone descending into something deeper than soil. Behind him, no one followed, no one spoke. That was the custom. Let the marked walk alone, not for cruelty, but because to share in their burden was to risk being chosen next. After Rawl disappeared around the bend toward the manor, Edric returned inside. The air felt heavier. Alice had heard the news, of course. Word travelled faster than fire. She was sitting on the edge of the pallet, Leni braiding her hair with tired fingers. Bram was quiet, playing with a pine cone he'd found in the ditch near the chapel wall. It was split on one side, and he was trying to fit the halves back together. "They'll come for someone else soon," Alice said. It wasn't a question. Edric nodded. "Always do." Their eyes met across the room. Nothing else needed saying. That night, they ate barley cakes with a thin smear of lard, sat in silence by the fire, and listened to the village breathe. Hours later, long after the children had gone to sleep, Edric stepped outside again. The moon was visible now, low and round above the thatched roofs. He looked toward the manor. No lights burned in its windows. No movement stirred. But he felt the weight of it nonetheless. The manor never slept, even when it was still, even when it was silent. It was always awake. The following morning, the village moved slower than usual. Not sluggish, not idle. Henton never afforded idleness, but slower, as if a quiet fog had seeped not just from the air, but into the joints and thoughts of its people. Word of Rawl's punishment had settled into the thatch and under the doors, woven into the morning routines like stray straw into a sleeping mat. No one spoke of it loudly, but everyone adjusted their steps, averted their eyes, took longer to draw water from the well. When someone's name had been spoken by the steward, everyone felt it, even if only through the way they held their spoons more carefully at breakfast. Edric rose early before the coals had cooled entirely and dressed in the quiet. He did not rouse Alice. She stirred only briefly as he pulled on his tunic and stepped outside. The air was crisp, holding the bite of the season's slow turn. The wind carried the scent of moss, smoke, and something older. Stone warmed by morning sun, the kind of scent that belonged not to any single place, but to the history of places. He walked not to the fields, nor the woodpile, nor the drying racks for the rushes, but toward the chapel. The chapel at Henton was not grand. It had never been painted, never decorated beyond the single stone crucifix above the door. The roof sagged slightly at one end, and ivy had crept up the eastern wall, swallowing a third of the window in curling green. But it was constant, older than the manor, older than most things. It had been here when Edric was born, when his father was born. It would be here when Bram's children, should he live to have them, buried him in the same soil. He didn't enter immediately. Instead, he circled behind the chapel, where the small cemetery sloped down toward the stream. There, among the unmarked stones and simple wooden crosses, he stood still, breathing in the silence. This was where his mother lay. No stone marked her place. They hadn't had the coin, nor the permission, but Edric remembered the spot. It was beside the crooked pine stump, where the grass always grew taller than elsewhere. He stood over it now, staring at nothing, hands deep in his sleeves. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He wasn't here for words. After a time, footsteps approached. Software familiar? Brother Toman moved like a man twice his age, though Edric knew they weren't so different in winters. The priest wore a cloak patched at the shoulders and sandals mended more times than could be counted. He said nothing at first, only joined Edric in his vigil. After several breaths, he murmured, "The rushes you brought last week helped the draft by the altar. They smell clean. Your Alice bound them well." Edric nodded. "They're not for prayer," he said. "Just for knees." Toman gave a quiet chuckle. "That's what all things are in the end." Another pause. "Raoul's punishment will stand," the brother said gently. "They won't lessen it. They never do. Not when they've chosen someone." Edric didn't respond. He watched a crow flutter down to the wall and peck at something near the moss. "I remember," Toman continued, "when your father was summoned to dig the trench behind the stables. Similar situation. Winter frost had taken too much grain. He'd hidden a sack, told no one. The steward found it, made an example. I remember," Edric said. "He came home with welts on his back and manure on his boots. Didn't speak for 3 days. Toman nodded. "But he walked home. That was something." They stood in silence again. A wind passed over them, shaking the leaves from a nearby ash tree. One landed near Edric's boot, yellow with a single brown edge, curling inward like a clenched hand. After a time, Edric turned toward the chapel door. "I need to light a candle." Toman opened the door without question. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with beeswax and dust. The chapel held no pews, only benches, and the altar was nothing more than a slab of stone draped in linen. A single icon hung above it, faded, wooden, the paint rubbed nearly to nothing. Edric approached the side table, placed a small coin in the cup, and struck the flint with practiced fingers. The candle flickered once, then held. He stared into the flame, not for guidance, for steadiness. Behind him, Toman said, "We do not have dominion here, Edric, but we do have endurance, and that is something." "Endurance isn't freedom." "No," the priest agreed. "It's what we build under the weight of no freedom." Edric let the silence stretch again. He didn't like philosophy, not when the animals still needed feeding and the roof still leaked, but he appreciated Toman's company. The man didn't lie, at least. He left the chapel not long after, candles still burning behind him. The rest of the day moved as days always did, measured in tasks, aches, and the quiet negotiation between effort and necessity. He repaired the coop's outer hinge, fetched a bundle of dry brushwood from the chapel's discarded pile, and helped May carry her broken bench to the square for the carpenter to examine. There was no pay. There never was. But when his name was called next, she would remember. That evening, as Alice rolled dough for flat cakes, Edric finally spoke of the chapel visit. Not in detail. just enough. She asked after your rush bindings, he said. Said they kept the altar warmer. Alice wiped flour from her hands. They were tied with wool cord, not twine, wool breathes. He smiled faintly. I'll remember that. And for a moment, just a breath, they were not tired people in a borrowed hut under a borrowed roof. They were simply two human beings who had known one another for decades, who still, despite the drag of every day, remembered how to smile. The next morning would come, the grain would run out again, the steward would call, the children would grow and their hunger with them. But the candle would still burn, somewhere in the chapel, and Edric would keep rising. It began with the sound of hooves, not many, but enough that Edric looked up from where he stood beside the fence post, hammer in hand. The sound was unmistakable, too quick, too sharp, too organized to be the passing of local carts or the meandering walk of a farmer's mare. These hooves moved with purpose, clattered over stone like declarations, and left no room for doubt. Visitors, nobles, someone important enough to stir the manor's gates at an hour when most of the village was still deep in the day's first tasks. The next morning would come. The grain would run out again. Steward would call. The children would grow and their hunger with them. But the candle would still burn, somewhere in the chapel, and Edric would keep rising. It began with the sound of hooves, not many, but enough that Edric looked up from where he stood beside the fence post, hammer in hand. The sound was unmistakable, too quick, too sharp, too organized to be the passing of local carts or the meandering walk of a farmer's mare. These hooves moved with purpose, clattered over stone like declarations, and left no room for doubt. Visitors, nobles, someone important enough to stir the manor's gates at an hour when most of the village was still deep in the day's first tasks. By the time Edric reached the bend in the road that overlooked the manor's entrance, a crowd had already begun to gather. Not a tight one, not bold certainly, but a careful swelling of curious bodies keeping to the side, pretending to pass on errands that hadn't existed 10 minutes ago. The village had learned the etiquette of watching without seeming to watch. You never stood still, never lingered too close. You kept your hands busy, shelling peas, pulling thorns from cloth, sweeping already clean steps, while your eyes took in everything. From his position near the hedgerow, Edric saw the riders dismount. 4 in total, one older, his cloak lined with fox fur despite the mild season, and the others younger, more brightly dressed, their boots so clean they looked like sculpture. Their horses were sleek, taller than the village plough beasts by a head, and snorted clouds of breath with idle impatience. A servant, barely older than Lena, scrambled to secure the reins. The older noble gestured once toward the steward, who had already emerged from the manor's door, bowing low, his cap in hand. The exchange was brief, no ceremony, no greetings shared with the watching village. The nobles did not see the village, they saw walls, roofs, things that passed by as they themselves passed through. Edric turned back before the group disappeared inside. He knew what would follow. Demands, rearrangements. The kitchen would take extra from the stores. Meat, most likely. Wine, certainly. The steward's boy would come around by evening with instructions. Additional firewood to be stacked by the manor's side entrance. Fresh rushes laid in the guest chamber. New linens borrowed from the chapel checked. All of it absorbed from the village. Always from the village. Nobility was a mouth that never fed itself. Back at the cottage, Alice had already heard. Of course she had. News passed faster than wind in Henton. Fox fur, she muttered without looking up from the basin. Middle of harvest, must be someone from over the ridge. Likely, Edric replied, setting down the kindling he'd gathered. They'll want roast and honey cakes. Alice snorted. They'll have them. It wasn't anger in her voice. Not exactly. Something more exhausted than that. a tone worn smooth by too many years of seeing the same theatre performed with new actors. She didn't resent the visitors. She resented how the world shifted around their presence, how their passing cast shadows longer than the buildings they never entered. Visitors meant more work. Visitors meant more watchfulness. Visitors meant that for the next 3 days, maybe 4, Henton would not belong to Henton. It would belong to the performance of hospitality. Sure enough, just after midday, the steward's boy appeared, breathless, cheeks pink from running, hair slicked back by rainwater. He didn't knock, just called from the lane. "Edric, to the manor. They want the north stack cleared by dusk. Wood sorted, no bark, no green." And to Alice, "Mistress wants rushes tonight. Dry ones, not straw." He ran off before either could answer. That too was part of the performance. Orders were not discussed. Orders echoed. Edric set to work immediately. The north stack hadn't been touched in weeks. It stood under the overhang behind the manor's kitchen door, wood stacked too loosely, some logs half rotted from poor drainage. Sorting it would take hours. He pulled on his oldest cloak, took up the gloves Alice had stitched from Bram's outgrown tunic, and began the walk up the hill. The manor was not far, but the incline made it feel distant. Each step up the slope was a reminder: the higher you climbed, the more clearly you could see who stood beneath you. The path curved past the chapel, past the steward's granary, and finally arrived at the rear gate. Edric didn't knock. The gate was already ajar, as if the building itself was indifferent to who entered, as long as they carried something and spoke little. The stack was worse than he expected. Rain had seeped through the upper rows, mould had crept into the corners, someone had used the lower tier for kindling without rotating the pile. Sloppy. Wasteful. But he said nothing. He set to work. He sorted in silence, moving the good wood into a new pile, tossing the green into a separate heap, to be split and dried later, if it wasn't already too far gone. The task was mindless, which was almost a relief. The steady rhythm of lifting, turning, stacking allowed him to think without thinking, to move without pausing. But he was aware, always, of the presence inside the manor. The laughter from the upper windows, the smell of roasting meat wafting from the kitchen flue. At one point, a snatch of music drifted into the yard, harp or pipe, something light and careless. It lasted only moments, but it stayed in his ears long after it had stopped. As dusk neared, his hands were scraped raw beneath the gloves and his shoulders ached from repetition. But the stack was done, sorted, ordered, presentable. He tied the last bundle, leaned it against the wall, and stepped back. A serving girl appeared with a nod. No thank you, just a glance, then she was gone. He returned home after dark, his hands tingling with chill, his eyes dry from the dust. Alice had laid out bread and onion. Lena had already gone to sleep. Bram was nodding off, cheek against the table. "They said nothing?" Alice asked, as she placed a cup of broth in front of him. Not a word. She didn't sigh, didn't scowl, just sat beside him, took a bite of her own bread, and began mending a tear in Bram's cloak. They ate together, the silence between them full of understanding. Tomorrow, the nobles would still be there. Tomorrow, the village would still bow, but the bread would still taste like work. And the hands that made it would still bear calluses. That night, after Bram had been tucked into the woolen cradle by the hearth, and Alice had retired with her sewing still in her lap, Edric remained awake longer than he'd intended, sitting by the door with one hand resting against the worn lintel, staring out at the lane. The air was cool but not biting, and the village lay under a soft, silver light that glowed faintly on the rooftops like dusted ash. No voices carried, no dogs barked. The world had finally silenced itself, but inside Edric's mind, the echoes remained. The scrape of wood, the heat of that silent manor, the laughter drifting from places he would never stand. He did not envy the nobility, not truly. He did not crave their clothing or music or warmth. But there was something in their ease that unsettled him. Not just that they lived above the burden, but that they had never even been taught its weight. That was what disturbed him most, the thought of being raised without knowing what must be endured. And worse still, the fear that his own children might never escape that weight, no matter how early they started learning. Behind him, he heard the faint shift of blankets and the rustle of straw as someone moved. At first, he assumed it was Alice, but the voice that followed was soft, higher. "Da?" Lena's voice came low from her mat, uncertain. He turned, surprised. "Still awake?" She sat up, her outline barely visible in the dim light. "I heard you come in. You were gone long." "Aye," he said gently, crossing the room and crouching beside her. "There were nobles at the manor. Needed work done. You know how it is." She nodded slowly but didn't lie down again. Her eyes searched his face, flickering between his jaw, his hands, the lines at the corners of his eyes. Children rarely ask the right questions, but tonight she did. Were they kind? The question hit him harder than he expected. He paused, looking at her more closely. Her hair had come loose from its braid, strands curling across her cheek. She wore the patched shift Elise had sewn last winter from one of his old undershirts, the sleeves rolled so many times they barely held the fold. She was small, still, but her eyes were wide in that way. Children's were when they were trying to understand how the world fit together, and more importantly, how they might fit within it. "No," he said finally. "They weren't cruel, but they weren't kind." She seemed to consider this. "Like the steward?" Edric nodded. "Exactly. They don't see us, Len, not really. We are part of the walls, part of the fields, part of the wood that burns and the grain that feeds them. They expect us to be there, and they expect us not to ask." She frowned slightly, brow furrowing. "But if we didn't bring the rushes or the wood, they'd be cold and hungry." "Aye," he whispered. "They would. Then why don't they thank us?" Her voice wasn't angry, it was quiet, genuine. A question born not of rebellion, but confusion. Edric sighed and reached forward, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Because they believe it's the way things are meant to be. They're told from the day they're born that this land, this village, even us, we are theirs to use. They do not think to thank the ground for giving way under their boots, or the air for letting them breathe." "But we're not the ground," Lena said softly. "We feel things." "Aye," he said again. "We do." For a moment neither spoke. The fire crackled faintly behind them, and Bram turned in his sleep, mumbling something incomprehensible. Outside, an owl hooted once, then flew off with a sudden flutter that startled the quiet. "I saw the lady," Lena whispered. "One of them. She looked from the manor window. She had gold on her fingers." Edric's heart tightened. "You shouldn't be near the manor, Lena." "I was just walking, past the orchard." "I wasn't close. She looked down, then walked away." He nodded, biting back the instinct to scold. Instead, he placed his hand on her shoulder. "It's not a place for you. Not now. Not ever, if we can help it." She didn't argue, but she understood. He could see it in her eyes, that small, terrible moment when a child's world tilts, and they realize some doors are not simply closed, they were never built for them to walk through. He stayed with her until her eyes began to droop again, her breath softening, her small hand curled into her shift, like she was trying to hold something still in her sleep. Then he rose, crossed the room, and returned to the doorway. The night had not changed, still silent, still glowing faintly under the weight of distant moonlight. But Edric felt heavier somehow, not from fatigue, but from the sudden awareness of how close the next generation stood to the burden he'd always carried. He had thought of it as his own, a stone passed down from father to son, unavoidable, but at least contained. But now Lene was asking questions, not childish ones, real ones, and the answers he had were dull blades, too blunt to cut the truth without tearing. The next day, as he split wood near the edge of the field, he watched her from a distance. She was gathering thistles with Alice, a small basket on her hip, head bent as she sorted the tender leaves from the tough ones. Her posture mimicked her mother's, her movements were cautious but efficient. She wasn't playing, she wasn't pretending, she was working already. He knew what would follow, the soft conscriptions, the lessons passed in chores, in silences, in glances exchanged between mother and daughter. She would learn the seasons not by names, but by what needed to be done. She would know the moon not by shape, but by which phase meant rushes were best cut. She would learn when to ask, when to wait, when to stay invisible. And someday she would stop asking why the noble didn't say thank you, because she would already know. That night, Edric sat by the fire with Alice and told her what Lena had said. She saw the lady, the gold rings, asked why they don't thank us. Alice didn't speak for a while. Then quietly, I asked the same thing once. He looked at her. My mother said the same thing you did, she continued, that they don't see us. But she said something else too. What's that? She said they don't thank the sun, but they scream when it disappears. Edric absorbed that in silence. Alice folded her hands in her lap. Maybe that's our power in the end. They won't notice us. But if we were gone, they'd feel the cold. Outside, the wind shifted, the fire popped, and for the first time in days, Edric felt the faint, fleeting stir of something that might one day become hope. The call came at mid-morning, just as Edric was trimming back the elderberry bush that had crept too far across the goat path. It wasn't a messenger this time, not a steward's boy with orders shouted from the lane, but a more formal visit, Corwin himself, the manners scribe, thin and precise and faintly sweet-smelling, from the ink he wore like perfume. He didn't knock, just stood with hands folded behind his back, his pale cloak clinging awkwardly to his knees in the light breeze. Edric saw him before he heard him, and by the time he'd stood upright and dusted the bits of bark from his tunic, the man had already begun speaking. The orchard is in need of clearing, Corwin announced, as though discussing something that existed in an entirely different world than the one before him. There are windfall apples rotting on the western edge. The manor's guests will take their morning stroll shortly. Lady Roswyn finds the smell offensive. He paused as though waiting for Edric to comment, object, or perhaps apologize for the smell of spoiled fruit beneath trees that had stood longer than either of them had drawn breath. Edric simply nodded. I'll go. Corwin gave a thin smile, the sort used when one has been obeyed without resistance and therefore need not pretend to be generous. He did not thank him. Of course not. He turned and left without another word. Edric packed a basket and a worn rake. He considered bringing a cloth for his shoulders. There was a chill in the orchard shade, but thought better of it. Better to look tired than comfortable. The path up toward the manor looped behind the chapel, past the herb gardens, and through the narrow gate beside the goat pens. It was a familiar walk, but one that always carried the sensation of stepping into someone else's drawing. Everything beyond the orchard gate was designed, shaped hedges, stone benches, a little fountain that no one drank from. Even the trees seemed neater, their trunks whitewashed, their limbs pruned in strict symmetry. Edric had walked among trees his whole life, but these ones felt unnatural in their perfection. He began in the far corner where the shadows gathered first. The windfall apples lay thick beneath the limbs, some bruised but salvageable, others already burst and leaking sweetness into the soil. He worked slowly, methodically, gathering the good into a pile for later culling, tossing the ruined ones into a separate basket destined for the swine. The smell was heady, fermented fruit, damp earth, the faint tang of copper from fallen leaves. He didn't mind it. It smelled like life. But Lady Roswin did not care for such things. She preferred lavender sachets and boiled linen. As he worked, voices drifted from beyond the yew hedge. Laughter, a woman's sigh, the dull thud of heeled boots on garden stone. He did not look up. He knew the rules. You did not speak unless spoken to. You did not meet the eye. You existed in the periphery, as necessary and invisible as the tools you carried. And yet, despite every effort, he could not stop his ears from hearing. It said she'd never seen a chicken with so many feathers, as though it had dressed for dinner. A burst of laughter followed, high and lilting. Another voice, softer. I do envy their lives. Imagine being born only to be served. Edric moved to the next tree, his hands sticky now with juice, the rake catching against the exposed roots. He had to kneel to free it, and as he did, a soft clump of footsteps approached. He did not rise, but he could see the hem of a gown trailing across the orchard path. Silk, embroidered, pale green with silver thread, the kind of fabric that drank light and never gave it back. The feet paused near him. You there? He looked up once, quickly. A young woman stood before him, not Lady Roswin, he knew her, from whispered stories, but someone close to her in station. Her face was pleasant, but blank. Not cruel, just incurious. She held a parasol, though there was no sun, and her hair was bound with pearls. Yes, milady, Edric said, eyes lowered again. What's your name? Edric, milady. She nodded, as though tasting the sound. You work well? Have you always lived here? All my life. She tilted her head. It must be restful to know your place. He did not answer. She did not notice. Or if she did not care. Well, she said, as though concluding a conversation that had never truly begun, do keep the western slope tidy. We'll be riding later, and I dislike the scent of bruised fruit. She turned and walked away. He watched her go, then returned to his task. The basket grew heavy, his back ached, his hands stained dark with pulp. By midday, the noble party had vanished indoors again, drawn to the promise of warm wine and idle entertainments. Edric remained in the orchard, finishing his task without audience or interruption. When he finally returned home, the light was already fading from the sky. Alice looked up from the hearth as he entered, her brow pinched in concern. They kept you long, she said. Orchard was thick with rot. She nodded. Did they say anything? One asked my name. Said I worked well, said it must be restful. Alice snorted, though there was no amusement in the sound. They think our silence is peace. They do. That night, they ate oatcakes with roasted turnips, and Lena asked if there would be time tomorrow to walk to the brook. Edric promised her there would be, and in the quiet after supper, as he cleaned the dirt from his nails and watched the fire curl around the last of the kindling, he thought about what restfulness meant, not ease, not leisure, but the quiet strength it took to carry insult without bending. To let the parasol pass overhead and know deep in the core of your body that you had been carved not from silk, but from something far older and harder. Wood, stone, earth. They left in the morning, not with ceremony, but with the faint smell of overripe apples still clinging to the air. The manor guests, with their clean boots and perfumed hair, their laughter that barely acknowledged the sky above them, departed as they had arrived, without looking behind them. Their horses were readied before sunrise, gleaming and restless, stamped hooves against the packed earth beside the gate. The steward stood beside them like a pale monument, hands clasped, nodding solemnly at every half-glance from a rider, though not a single word passed between him and the noble guests unless it was summoned with a look. Edric watched from behind the chapel hedge as the final horse disappeared down the hill. He hadn't planned to watch them go. It just happened that way. He'd been out gathering kindling early, trying to beat the crows to the dry branches fallen near the edge of the forest, and by the time he returned, the procession was already forming. From where he stood, he could see the crushed line of grass where the carts had turned, the muddy prints etched into the yard like bruises in skin, and the broken stems of the rushes that had lined the guest entrance. Nothing in their leaving felt final. It felt more like a retreat than a conclusion, a curtain drawn quickly, as if even the nobles themselves were eager to forget the village whose hands had fed them. By midday, the wind had changed. The scent of roasted meat no longer wafted from the manor chimney, and the chapel bells rang at their usual pace again, slow, reluctant, hollow. Edric spent the early hours helping the steward's boy, who had been tasked naturally with undoing all signs of elegance the guests had left behind. The lad worked with a kind of distracted bitterness, muttering under his breath about crumbs in the entryway and beeswax stains on the sill. Left their skins behind, he grumbled, nodding toward a discarded lace glove crumpled on the garden bench. Wouldn't bend to pick it up if it caught fire. Edric didn't reply. He'd learned long ago that conversation with those half in the manor and half in the village was like leaning too far off the edge of a cart. Sooner or later you fell, and no one stopped to help you back up. Instead, he gathered the rushes from the steps, stripping away the trampled ones, bundling the rest for drying and reuse. Waste was for those who could afford ignorance. The manor itself had changed in their wake. It always did. It took on a kind of hollow grandeur, like a feast table after the plates had been cleared. You could still smell the salt, still see the wine stains in the wood grain, but the warmth had gone. And not just warmth, life. What had bustled only a day ago now stood quiet, unmoving. The doors were closed again, the windows shuttered to the morning breeze. The manor slept. Back at the cottage, Alice was already boiling water to scrub the wool rush mats she'd lent for the guest rooms. They hadn't been returned so much as dropped near the gate in a heap, sodden with foot traffic and stained with whatever oil the nobles dabbed on their necks to smell of roses and oranges. She worked without speaking, her sleeves pushed up, fingers red from the heat. Her movements were tight, efficient, not angry, but resolved. They took nothing with them, Edric said, setting down the bundle of kindling near the hearth. Alice snorted. They always take something, even if we don't see it go. He understood her meaning. The manor guests didn't steal bread or spoons, they stole rhythm, energy, dignity. The days around their visit stretched long and thin, and the days after collapsed like wet canvas. Even now, with them gone, the village remained tense, braced for the next command, the next reckoning. It took time to return to oneself. Later that afternoon, Edric walked past the orchard again. He wasn't assigned to be there. He just wanted to see it. The windfalls had been cleared. The branches still hung with a few stubborn apples. But what struck him most was the path, the place where the guests had walked, laughed, paused for wine and gossip. It was already returning to normal. The grass was beginning to rise again, tentatively. A few petals from a crushed bloom lay scattered like bruises on the stone. He bent and picked one up, pale pink. It still held its scent. For some reason he couldn't name, he tucked it into his belt. He returned home through the longer path, circling past the stream where Bram sometimes splashed stones and Lena collected smooth pebbles for her doll's house. The water was low, humming gently against the banks. There were footprints here too, small, muddy, trailing toward the reeds. He smiled faintly. Children did not care for performances. They watched horses with wide eyes but did not yet understand the weight of being unseen. When he stepped back through the door of the cottage, Lena looked up from the hearth where she was threading wool through a narrow band of linen. "Did they leave?" she asked, voice bright. "Aye," he said, setting down the kindling. "Early this morning." "Did they wave?" "No," he said, "they didn't." She nodded, as if that made perfect sense, then returned to her stitching. Edric sat down beside her, pulled off his boots and let the silence settle around them. Alice handed him a bowl of broth, thinner than usual but warm, and sat beside him without speaking. He thought then about what the nobles would remember of this visit. The crisp air, the orchard, the firewood that burned evenly because he'd sorted it by hand, or nothing at all. They would remember a tidy manor, a pleasant walk, apples perhaps. But they would not remember the names, not Edric, not Alice, not Lena. They would remember a place that functioned, but not the people who made it function. 3 days after the nobles had departed, and the manor's windows were once again shuttered against the wind, the oven was lit. Not the hearths inside the cottages, which were lit every day, with barely enough kindling to warm broth or soften root vegetables, but the communal bread oven near the edge of the village green. It stood squat and wide, its chimney leaning like a bent old man, smoke escaping through the broken stone in irregular puffs. It was not a pretty thing, but it was old, and, like the village itself, it had outlived its builders, its cracks held together by layers of patched mortar and a shared understanding of its purpose. The oven belonged to everyone and no one, and when it was lit, the village came alive. Edric noticed it by the smell first, smoke, not from oak or pine, but from the denser fruitwood bundles that burned slower, steadier. The kind used when baking loaves that needed hours to rise, rest, and brown without scorching. He was on his way back from the stream, having collected 3 small trout tangled in the reeds, when the wind shifted and carried the scent to him. Smoke and flour and something else, warmth perhaps, or memory. He paused, squinting toward the rising column. It was midday, and he hadn't planned to join the baking this time. Their grain was low, and Alice had insisted on saving what was left for porridges and flat cakes cooked quickly over the fire. But something in him wanted to go, not for the bread, for the gathering. When he arrived, the green was already half-circled with figures, women mostly, sleeves rolled, arms dusted in flour, their voices low but rising occasionally in laughter. A few men stood to the side, leaning on staves or stone walls, offering help when asked and silence when not. The oven's mouth glowed faintly red as a few of the older boys managed the coals, scraping ash to the back, making space for the first round of loaves to go in. Edric nodded to May, who was patting dough into a thick round. She nodded back without stopping. "Didn't think you were baking," she said. "Didn't plan to," he replied. "Well, you've shown up empty-handed, so unless you want a scrap of crust for supper, you best earn your watch." She smiled as she said it, and he smiled back. This was the language of the green, barbed and warm. It welcomed only those who knew how to take a jest without bruising. He stepped in beside the boys, helping shift the wood as needed. The heat from the oven was intense, drying the skin on his hands even from several feet away. It clung to him like summer in springtime. The smoke caught in his throat, but he didn't cough. As the loaves were slid in, round, flat, twisted with herbs or flecked with onions, the conversation picked up. It always did at the oven. Something about the rising of bread loosened the tightness usually drawn around mouths. Perhaps it was the shared labor, or the sense of making something beautiful out of something plain. Perhaps it was just the fire. They talked of the weather, whether the cold would return before lambing season finished, of Raoul's trench, which was nearly done, and, according to Bren, already flooding from poor drainage, of Lena's quiet, clever hands, and how she'd helped bind rushes at the chapel better than girls twice her age, and they spoke softly of the nobles. "I heard one asked Edric his name," Matey said, tossing a dusting of flour over her board. "Heard that too," muttered Tom, who'd been chewing the same bit of bark all winter. "Asked if it was restful to live like we do." A wave of laughter rose, not loud, but solid. "Restful," Alice repeated dryly as she stepped onto the green carrying her own wrapped bundle of dough. "I'll be sure to think on that the next time I'm up before the crows with chilblains on my toes." "Perhaps they think we sleep standing up," someone called, and more laughter followed. Edric smiled but didn't add to it. He was watching the oven, the way the heat licked at the dough, transforming it slowly, puffing it upward, darkening its edges. There was something sacred about it, though the chapel would never call it so. He wondered if the nobles even once had watched bread rise. When the first round was done, the loaves were pulled out with long paddles and laid on clean cloth. The smell was thick, almost overwhelming, yeast and grain and crust. Alice's loaf was darker than the others, streaked with bits of char where the dough had stuck to the peel, but it held its shape. "A fine bread," Edric murmured as she lifted it. "It will hold us," she said. "That's enough." He took it from her hands, letting its heat pass into his palms. It weighed less than he expected, but he could feel its strength. They shared the loaf later that evening, breaking it in half and passing the pieces between them, letting the crumbs fall where they would. Bram devoured his in 2 bites. Lena held hers longer, pulling it apart slowly, eating from the inside first. Alice saved her portion until last, chewing each piece with quiet satisfaction. After the meal, they sat by the hearth. Edric leaned back, legs stretched, the glow of the day's fire warming his feet. "You think they'll come back?" Lena asked softly. "Who?" Edric replied, though he knew. "The ones with the shiny gloves." He nodded slowly. "They always come back. Maybe not the same ones, but there's always more." Lena tilted her head. "Why?" Alice answered. "Because the manor's doors open outward. They lead here, ours don't." "But we have bread," Lena said, holding up the last bit of crust proud. Edric looked at her, heart full. "Aye," he said, "we do, and it's ours." And in that moment, he believed it. The storm began with silence. Not thunder, not wind, just a strange stillness, the kind that made even the crows hesitate. It came slowly, in layers, the sky darkening not with anger, but with a sort of cold indifference. By mid-afternoon, the clouds were thick as wet wool, and hanging so low they seemed to rest on the tops of the trees. Edric stood outside the cottage with one hand on the lintel, watching the light bleed from the lane. The colours of the village, straw, soot, wood, skin, were swallowed into grey. The air felt like breath held too long. "Roof will leak again," he muttered. though he was speaking more to himself than to Alice, who had already begun pulling the thicker quilts from the trunk. She didn't answer. She was counting, checking corners, smoothing old folds, preparing. She moved like someone who had known storms not just as weather, but as visitors. Those who arrive uninvited, stay too long, and leave behind work. By the time the first drops fell, Edric had already secured the tool shed, tied the door of the goat pen, and laid an extra plank over the hearth's flue. The rain came in sheets, not a downpour, but steady, insistent. It hit the thatch with a sound like rice in a tin bowl, familiar, resented. Inside, the cottage felt smaller than usual. The window coverings were drawn, the shutters latched tight. The fire was low but steady, its heat absorbed more than felt. Bram curled beneath a wool wrap like a burrowed pup, while Lena sat cross-legged near the hearth, picking at a ball of leftover yarn, weaving it through her fingers in a quiet rhythm. Her mouth moved slightly as if she were reciting something, though Edric couldn't hear the words. He sat near the door, knife in hand, whittling a bit of driftwood he'd found by the stream last week. Not into anything particular. Just carving, peeling away the rough outer layer to reveal something smoother underneath. There was no plan, just motion. The storm would do as it pleased. They did not speak much that day. Speech during a storm always felt like shouting across water. There was nothing to say, only things to think, and each member of the household retreated into their own silence like animals settling into straw. Alice worked methodically, scrubbing the boards near the door, wiping the shelves with vinegar cloth, checking the grain sacks for damp. These were tasks she could do blind, and Edric watched her without comment, knowing that in her world, order was not a comfort, it was a shield. By nightfall, the wind picked up. It didn't scream, not yet, but it pushed. Edric felt it through the gaps in the wood, the way it sought corners and seams. He rose and added more moss to the window cracks, then returned to the fire, which Alice had stoked with 2 precious pieces of hardwood from the covered pile. The room warmed quickly. Bram sighed in his sleep. Lena rested her head against the hearthstone and closed her eyes. "I'll sit up a while," Edric said softly. Alice nodded. "I'll wake early." That was how they shared the storm, by watching its edges. One rested while the other stood guard. The hours passed slowly, punctuated only by the sound of dripping, creaking, the occasional shift of a beam in the wind. Edric did not sleep. He stared into the fire, his thoughts moving like low clouds, wide, formless, full of weight. He thought about the manor, about the nobles whose roofs would not leak tonight, about the steward who would still have dry socks in the morning, about the bread oven and the warmth it had given them, already faded. He thought too of his father, of the storms they'd sat through in this same room, the same hearth, the same smell of damp wool. He remembered being Lainey's age, watching the door, like it might fly open, unsure if the storm would only bring rain or something worse. Sometimes the real danger came afterward, when the thatch collapsed, or the paths flooded, or the steward noticed which homes had fared worst, and used it as reason for new demands. But this one, Edric knew, would not break them. It was not angry, it was just thorough. In the morning, the rain softened, became a mist. The sky was still heavy, but the worst had passed. Edric stepped outside, boots thick with mud, and surveyed the damage. The goat pen roof had lost a few reeds. The path to the green was a rivulet. But the cottage stood, the chimney drew, the fire hadn't gone out. Back inside, he wiped his hands and accepted the cup of hot water Alice passed him. There was no tea, only heat, but it was enough. "We'll mend today," she said. He nodded. "I'll walk to the smith's, check the drainage near the well." She handed him a square of coarse cloth. "Take this for Bren's mother. She lost a shutter." He folded it into his pouch. "Lena can come?" Alice glanced at the girl, who was now awake, combing knots from her hair with a carved stick. "If she wears your old cloak." Lena grinned. She liked the cloak. It smelled like fields and salt and ash. And so they began again. No ceremony, no declarations. Just the quiet reconstruction of what had been softened by water, weighted by wind. The village would not remember this storm as a story. It would become part of the season. A thing survived. That night, the wind was gone, and the moon returned, pale, hidden behind gauze, but visible. Edric sat outside again, on the step this time, with Leni beside him, Bram asleep in Elise's lap. "It's strange," Leni said, "how the sky can feel close and far at the same time." Edric looked up. "Aye, it presses and floats." She leaned against him, her hair smelling of smoke and straw. "I'm glad the oven still stands." He smiled. "So am I." And together they watched the sky, not for danger, but for shape, for the curve of something they would never name, but always recognize. The sun returned in the way only early spring sunlight can, quietly, not as a triumphant declaration, but like a guest returning without knocking. It broke through the clouds in narrow columns, dappled rather than bold, and where it fell on the village green, it turned the puddles into mirrors and the mud into velvet. The air no longer stung, but smelled instead of wet earth, fire ash, and something faintly green. Not grass, not yet, but the first hint of it, the scent of becoming. For the first time in days, the wind rested. Edric woke before the others, his body already registering the shift in the weather. His joints ached less, his breath came easier. He rose slowly, careful not to rouse Bram, who slept with one foot sticking out from the wool wraps like a defiant root. Alice murmured something in her sleep, then turned her face deeper into the quilt. Lena, as always, slept lightly. Her eyes fluttered open even as Edric pulled on his cloak. "Today?" she whispered, still not fully awake. He nodded. Today. By the time they reached the stream, the sun had begun to warm the tops of the reeds. Lena walked ahead, her steps light, skipping occasionally but never too far. She carried a small satchel Alice had sewn from leftover scraps, the same one she used for pebble collecting. Edric followed, not slowly, but with a deliberateness born of age and thought. He liked to let her lead. She needed to know the shape of the world on her own terms. The stream was low, swollen slightly from the storm but not flooded. Its banks had muddied but not broken. The water moved with purpose, quick, clear, humming to itself in a language older than the manor, older than the village, older than anyone who had ever named it. They didn't speak much at first. Lena crouched near the water's edge, sorting through stones with the dedication of a scholar. She held them to the light, tapped them together, tossed back those too sharp or dull. Edric sat on a half-dry log a few paces away watching her, occasionally adjusting the hood of his cloak when the breeze shifted. "I want one with a hole," Lena said suddenly, not looking up. "A real one, all the way through." Edric smiled faintly. "Those are lucky." "I know," she replied. "May said her mother wore one round her neck when she gave birth. They keep away the ill spirits," he said, more as a tradition than a belief. "Do they work?" He shrugged. "They make people feel better." She nodded, satisfied with that. After a while, she brought him a handful to inspect. He looked them over, turning each in his palm. One was nearly perfect, smooth, blue-grey, worn round at the edges, and, yes, with a hole nearly centered. "You found it," he said. She grinned. You can keep it. For your belt." He hesitated. "It's yours." "I'll find another. You do more walking." He tied it onto the leather strip at his waist without another word. The rest of the morning passed in small movements, picking, turning, placing. They gathered not only stones but bits of bark, dried seed pods, a feather that might have belonged to a jay. At one point, Lena stopped and pointed skyward. "See that bird?" He followed her gaze. High above, a lone shape circled, not a hawk, not a crow. He squinted. "Kite," he said. "Haven't seen one since last year. Is it looking for mice? Or just watching?" They watched it together until it wheeled away. When they returned to the village, the light was golden, the path dappled. The mud had begun to crust, hardening into shapes of footsteps already past. Smoke rose from the cottages in steady ribbons. A few voices drifted over the green, Bren's boys hauling wood, May calling her dog, someone tapping nails into the chapel fence. The rhythm was back, not forced, not hurried, just resumed. The world continued. That was the miracle. Not that it had changed, but that it insisted on being itself again despite everything. At home, Alice had already laid out the day's tasks, a bit of mending, some marrow to boil from yesterday's bone, a second sweep through the grain sack to shake out any damp rot. But when she saw Edric and Lena return, flushed, smiling, with pockets clinking full of river-washed memory, she said nothing about the clock. She only took the satchel and began sorting through it, setting aside the sharp ones, placing the best in the bowl by the window where she kept her sewing needles. That night, Edric took the lucky stone from his belt and placed it near the hearth. Not hidden, but not displayed, just there, like a talisman or a truth. It was not wealth, it was not power, but it was chosen, it was clean. It had been shaped by water, not by hands. Later, as the fire dimmed and the children slept, Edric and Alice sat together in silence. "She's getting older," Alice said, not as complaint, not as fear, just as fact. "She asks good questions. She watches you." "She's braver than I ever was," Edric replied. They didn't say more, they didn't need to, because in that quiet room, beneath a roof patched more times than they could count, on a floor worn smooth by foot and broom and small joys, they had everything they needed to remember what the world could be. Not fair, but enduring. The day folded in on itself slowly, like an old quilt turned down at the edges, its seams creased by familiarity. The sun lowered behind the hills with no urgency, casting long blue shadows over the thatch rooftops of Henton. One by one, chimneys released their final offerings of smoke, thin and sweet, curling into the cooling air like sighs. The geese, long since settled behind the chapel, tucked their heads beneath wings without protest. Somewhere, a pail clanked against a stone threshold. A gate groaned shut. The village was quieting, not silenced, but softened. Edric stood at the edge of the green, watching. He hadn't meant to linger, but something about the light, the way it turned everything the colour of warm milk and ash, had stopped him. The grass beneath his boots was still damp from the last storm, but drying. The earth was trying. He watched as May carried a small stool inside, her back bent just slightly more than last year. Tom crossed toward the oven, now cool, collecting a few leftover ash bundles to be scattered along his bean rows in the morning. These were movements so familiar Edric could have sketched them with his eyes closed, and yet he felt something new in them tonight. A reverence, maybe, or perhaps just recognition. The village, for all its wear and hardship, still moved as one, still exhaled together. He turned and walked the long way back to the cottage, not out of hesitation, out of habit, out of love for the bends in the path, the spots where he could hear the stream more clearly, or where the air always smelled faintly of chamomile, though no one could remember where the flowers had come from. The sky overhead had paled to the colour of bone, soft and empty. The moon, not yet risen, waited its turn behind the trees. Inside, the fire was down to coals, but the warmth still held. Linus and Bram were already asleep. Lena in her usual curl near the hearth, Bram sprawled awkwardly across the mat, one sock off and one on, his fingers still gripping a wooden spoon like a sword. Alice sat on the low stool by the table, mending a tear in the grain sack. Her stitches were slow even. Edric sat beside her, said nothing at first, just listened to the rhythm of the needle. In, out, pull, in, out, pull. He grew another inch, Alice said without looking up. His boots won't make it through planting. I'll speak to Bren, Edric replied. See if he has any of Olva's old ones tucked away. She nodded. Another stitch. And Lena's shift. She'll need a warmer one by summer. Something light but tight woven. I'll ask May about linen scraps. Still her hands moved. Still the rhythm stayed. After a while she set the sack aside, rubbed her eyes and finally met his gaze. You look older today, she said. I feel older. Storm did that? Number the quiet after? She tilted her head. It's the quiet that breaks us? No, he said gently. It's what comes into it. The thoughts we keep away during the noise. Alice smiled faintly, reached across the table, and placed her hand over his. You've done well, she said. He looked down at her hand, calloused, lined, beautiful. So have you. They sat like that for a while, their fingers interlaced, the fire humming softly behind them, like a lullaby with no melody. Outside, the wind stirred the reeds near the fence. A goat snorted once, rolled over, and went back to sleep. Later, after Alice had settled beneath the blankets and Edric had covered the fire with its iron plate, he stepped outside one last time. The moon had risen at last, not full, not bright, but there, steady. It painted the path in silver and made the empty green look almost holy. He stood beneath it, alone, and felt not lonely but held, by the sky, by the weight of everything he'd carried, and by the quiet knowledge that tomorrow the world would begin again. That someone would wake first, that someone would carry water, that bread would rise, that children would grow, that he, in all his smallness, had helped hold the village in place. And no one would thank him, but they would eat the bread and sleep in warmth and live another day. And somehow that was enough.